While repairing my car, the mechanic turned pale as a sheet, and then the doctor pulled me aside after my test results came back and whispered, "Mr. Harmon, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room." At that moment, my daughter sent me a text. "Dad, dinner's almost ready. Come home. You won't believe what my daughter had been putting in my food." Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The symptoms started in October, 6 weeks after my daughter moved back in. I told myself it was the season changing. Portland autumns have a way of getting into your joints, your chest, your head. 67 years old, retired after 38 years as a forensic accountant for the state of Oregon, I was allowed to feel tired. I'd earned tired. But this was something different. This was waking up at 2 inches the afternoon, having gone to bed at 9 the night before, and still feeling like someone had filled my legs with wet sand. This was dropping a coffee mug because my fingers simply stopped working for a moment. This was standing in the bathroom mirror one Tuesday morning, looking at a man I barely recognized, wondering when his hands had started shaking. My daughter had an explanation for everything. "Dad, you're not young anymore," she'd say, setting a cup of herbal tea on the table beside me with practiced efficiency. "You need to slow down. Let me take care of things for a while." She'd moved in with her husband at the end of August. They said it was temporary, their lease had ended, and they needed 2 months to find a new place. 2 months had stretched into 8 weeks with no apartment search. I could see. No viewings, no conversations about neighborhoods or prices. Just the two of them living in my 4-bedroom house on Eastmoreland Drive, eating my food, watching my television, and slowly, methodically, making me feel like a guest in my own home. My wife Margaret had died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. We had 31 years together, and when she was gone, the house felt like a body without a spine still standing. But only technically. My daughter had come to the funeral, stayed a week, called every Sunday for about 2 months, and then the calls became every other Sunday, then once a month, then almost never. Until August, when she showed up at my door with her husband and 4 suitcases and a smile I should have read more carefully. My son-in-law was a man who'd been between jobs for the better part of 3 years. He had a way of sitting in my living room that made it feel like his living room. He'd rearranged the furniture while I was at a doctor's appointment in September. I came home and the couch I'd bought with Margaret was facing a different wall. He said the feng shui was better. I didn't say anything. I was already starting to feel too tired to argue about furniture. By October, I had a persistent metallic taste in my mouth that I couldn't explain. My appetite disappeared in the mornings and returned with nausea in the evenings. I was dropping weight 8 pounds in 6 weeks, which my bathroom scale confirmed with the cold indifference of numbers. I made an appointment with my primary care physician, Dr. Linda Marsh, who I'd been seeing for 12 years. She was thorough, unhurried, the kind of doctor who actually looked at you when you talked. She ordered a full panel. "Standard stuff," she said. "Given my age and symptoms, just covering the bases." She called me 4 days later and asked me to come in alone. I almost brought my daughter. My daughter had been coming to appointments with me since September, sitting in the corner with her phone, occasionally asking questions the doctor hadn't asked yet. It had seemed helpful at the time. Attentive. Loving, even. I'd told myself I was lucky to have her there. Something in Dr. Marsh's voice made me drive to that appointment by myself. She closed the office door behind me and sat down across from her desk, instead of behind it. That's when I knew whatever she was about to say was not about my cholesterol. "Walter," she said, and she used my first name, which she almost never did. "Some of these results are outside of any range I'd expect from natural causes. Specifically, I'm looking at your blood work, and I'm seeing markers consistent with heavy metal toxicity. Low level, cumulative, but unmistakable." She paused, watching my face. "This isn't something that happens from the environment. Not at these levels. Not this fast." The room went very quiet. "What you're describing," I said slowly, 38 years of reading fraud and other people's paperwork steadying my voice, "is poisoning." She held my gaze. "I'm describing a finding that requires immediate follow-up testing. I'm referring you to a toxicologist today. But Walter, I need to ask you directly, who prepares your food at home?" I drove home in a state I can only describe as controlled freefall, the kind of clarity that arrives when you've been handed information so catastrophic that panic would be a luxury you can't afford. I had spent nearly 4 decades tracing embezzlement through pension funds, finding deliberate fraud hidden inside quarterly reports, sitting across from people who'd stolen from retirees and widows while maintaining the expression of a man discussing the weather. I knew what deliberate concealment looked like. I knew what it felt like to hold evidence that pointed somewhere you hadn't wanted it to point. My daughter's car was in the driveway. She was in the kitchen when I came in, stirring something on the stove, her back to me, humming something low and tuneless. My son-in-law was in the living room with the television on. The house smelled like the soup she made twice a week, chicken broth, carrots, whatever herbs she kept in the cabinet by the window. The soup she always said was good for me. The soup she always insisted I finish. "Dad, perfect timing," she said without turning. "Dinner's almost ready. I made that soup you like. I said I wasn't hungry. I said I was going to lie down." In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed Margaret and I had shared for 20 years, and I looked at my hands, which were still shaking. Not from illness, from the weight of what I was beginning to understand. My son-in-law owed money. I knew this because I'd overheard a phone call in September, his voice low and tight from behind the guest room door. Numbers I recognized because I'd spent my career tracking numbers. $80,000. Something about a deal that went wrong, a timeline, consequences if payments didn't arrive. I'd filed it away the way I filed everything, labeled it as concern but not alarm. People had financial trouble. That didn't make them dangerous. That didn't make them willing to hurt someone. I thought about my will. Margaret and I had written our wills together. Everything split evenly between our daughter and the Children's Hospital Foundation Margaret had volunteered at for 20 years. The house alone appraised at $520,000 last spring. The retirement accounts, the life insurance policy, the investment portfolio I'd built over 35 years, the total was somewhere above $800,000. $800,000. And my daughter prepared every meal I ate. I pulled out my phone and called the only person I trusted completely at that moment. My neighbor, Frank DeLuca, had lived 3 houses down for 11 years. Retired Portland Police Bureau, 32 years on the force, the last 12 as a detective. He was 64, quiet, precise, the kind of man who noticed things without appearing to. We'd become close after Margaret died. He'd knocked on my door 3 days after the funeral with a casserole his sister had made. And we'd sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. He'd lost his wife 6 years earlier. He understood the particular silence of a house that used to hold 2 people. Frank picked up on the second ring. "I need to talk to you," I said. "Not tonight, not here, tomorrow morning." A beat of silence. Frank was good at reading what people weren't saying. 7 o'clock, he said. "My place. I'll have coffee." I barely slept. I lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house, my daughter and son-in-law's voices through the wall, too low to make out words. The television eventually going quiet, the particular creak of the third stair that I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. I ran calculations I didn't want to run. Timeline of symptoms started approximately 2 to 3 weeks after they moved in, which accounted for accumulation time. Method of delivery: daily soup, prepared by my daughter, consumed by me alone. Financial motive: $80,000 in debt, an estate worth $800,000. Opportunity: complete, unquestioned access to my food. I had spent my career proving that the most sophisticated fraud is never the flashiest. The best theft is the kind that looks natural. A slow decline in an elderly widower who was already grieving, already isolated, already expected to get sick. That wasn't murder. That was just sad. That was just his time. I drove to Frank's before my daughter was awake. He handed me coffee and listened without interrupting for 20 minutes. When I finished, he set down his mug with the deliberate calm of a man who'd heard terrible things before and knew how to hold them steady. "You have the test results with you?" I handed him the paperwork from Dr. Marsh. He read it twice. He was quiet for a long moment. "The toxicologist appointment is when?" "Thursday." "Good." He looked at me. "Here's what you don't do. You don't confront them. You don't change your behavior in any way they can notice. You go home, you eat what she gives you, and you don't eat it. I stared at him. You eat enough not to raise suspicion, he said. Small portions. Move food around the plate. But you don't consume what she prepares. I'll bring you food. I'll come by with something every morning before they're up. You tell her you've been nauseous and you're trying a blander diet. She'll adapt, but it'll slow her down. Frank, I know what I'm asking. His voice was even. I've had this conversation before, not with a friend. He paused. We need evidence, not suspicion, not a test result that she can explain away as environmental exposure. We need evidence that survives a courtroom. I drove home with a container of Frank's leftover pasta in a bag on the passenger seat and a weight in my chest that felt geological. My daughter was awake when I got back, standing in the kitchen in her bathrobe, and she looked at me with an expression of such practiced concern that I had to remind myself to let it land on me the way it was supposed to. Dad, you were up so early. Are you feeling okay? Couldn't sleep, I said. Went for a drive. She put her hand on my arm. Let me make you some tea. I let her make me tea. I poured it down the bathroom sink when she wasn't looking. The toxicologist confirmed everything on Thursday. Dr. Kevin Okafor, methodical and careful, explained what he was seeing in terms that left no room for alternative interpretation. The compound present in my bloodstream was a particular form of heavy metal salt, tasteless, odorless, available online, accumulating in soft tissue over weeks or months. At the level he was seeing, continued exposure for another 60 to 90 days would likely cause kidney failure. It would look, he said, like a complication of age. It would look like the natural decline of an elderly man in poor health. He asked who had access to my food. I told him my daughter and son-in-law. I told him I hadn't eaten anything I hadn't personally prepared in the past 4 days. He said he was required to contact authorities. I told him to hold off for 72 hours. I told him I was a retired state forensic accountant with nearly 4 decades of building evidentiary cases, and I needed 72 hours. He looked at me for a long moment. 72 hours, he said. Then I'm making the call regardless. Frank was waiting in his truck around the corner from my house. I climbed in and told him what the toxicologist had said. Frank was quiet for the length of 2 stoplights. Then he said, "We need cameras." He had equipment already. I didn't ask why a retired detective had 3 wireless HD cameras with motion-activated night vision in a case in his garage, because it didn't matter. What mattered was that by that evening, while my daughter and son-in-law were at a grocery store 40 minutes away, I'd given her cash and a list, a long list, everything I could think of. Frank had installed a camera covering my kitchen from behind the upper cabinet near the refrigerator, one in the dining room, and one in the hallway outside my bedroom. Cloud storage. Frank's account, nothing stored locally that could be deleted. They need to prepare food and add something to it on camera, Frank said. We get that, and there's no defense. I nodded. How are you holding up? I thought about the honest answer. I looked out Frank's truck window at the ordinary street I'd lived on for 22 years. The maple tree in my front yard that Margaret had planted the year our daughter was born, and I tried to locate an emotion I recognized. What I found was something older and colder than grief, something professional. I'm okay, I said. I've been building cases against people my whole career. This is just the one that matters most. Frank put a hand on my shoulder briefly. Nothing more was needed. That evening, I deployed the first calculated move. Over dinner, I moved food around my plate while my daughter watched me with that expression of attentive concern she'd been practicing. I mentioned casually that I'd been thinking about the house. Too much maintenance for one person, I said. Too many memories, maybe. I'd been talking to a realtor. I thought I might sell. The silence at the table changed texture. My son-in-law's fork stopped moving. My daughter set down her glass with a precision that was trying to appear casual and failing. She said, "Dad, you can't be serious." "Why not?" I asked pleasantly. "The market's good. If I sell now, I could clear enough to buy a nice condo on the east side and still have a very comfortable cushion, travel a little. I've always wanted to see Portugal. This is your home. my daughter said. Her voice was controlled, but the edges were showing. You raised me here. Mom is in this house. I let that sit. Let her believe she'd landed a blow. Something to think about, I said. I'm also talking to my attorney next week about updating some paperwork. You know how it is at my age. My son-in-law looked at my daughter. It lasted less than a second. But I had 38 years of watching people exchange looks across tables, and that one said everything. I called my attorney the next morning. Richard Calloway had handled my estate planning for 15 years, sharp, unhurried, someone who remembered details across years of appointments. I told him I wanted to revise my will completely. He asked if I was sure. I told him about the test results, about the toxicologist, about the cameras in my kitchen. Richard didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, I'll have something ready by end of day. Come in at 2. I revised everything. The house, the retirement accounts, the life insurance, the investment portfolio, the joint savings account Margaret and I had started in 1994. All of it directed to a combination of the Oregon Children's Foundation and the hospice organization that had helped Margaret in her last weeks. My daughter received $1 and a line in the document that read, for reasons of which she is aware. Richard registered and notarized everything that afternoon. A copy went to his firm's safe. A copy went to my safe deposit box at my bank on Burnside, where I stopped on the way home with a detour my daughter didn't know about. I changed my locks the following morning. A locksmith was there by 8, finished by 9. I told my daughter I'd lost my spare key and decided to replace everything as a precaution. She watched the locksmith work with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was a teenager, caught in a lie, calculating, masked by performance. Makes sense, she said. Safety first. I did not give her a new key. Frank came by that evening under the pretense of borrowing a socket wrench. We stood in my garage, and he told me the camera footage from the past 30 hours showed my daughter adding something from a small amber bottle to food being prepared in my kitchen on 2 separate occasions, once to the soup, once to a smoothie she'd left on the counter for me. The one she always said was for my energy levels. The amber bottle was in the cabinet above the stove, behind a row of spice jars. We have it on video, Frank said, twice. Clear shot of her hands, the bottle, the food. I sat down on the bench along my garage wall. The bench Margaret had bought at a yard sale years ago because she wanted somewhere to sit when she came out to talk to me while I pretended to organize tools I didn't know how to use. I sat on that bench and I thought about the girl who used to fall asleep on the living room couch with her shoes still on. The girl I'd driven to soccer practice twice a week for 4 years. The girl who'd cried at her mother's funeral with her face buried in my shoulder. Then I thought about the amber bottle. Call your contact at the bureau, I said. It's time. Frank had already drafted the call. He'd been a detective for 12 years. He knew how to build a handoff. By 11 that night, Detective Anna Kowalski from Portland PD had been briefed. She arrived at Frank's house, not mine, so nothing would register on a doorbell camera or prompt questions. She reviewed the footage on Frank's laptop, and the expression on her face told me everything I needed to know about the severity of what she was looking at. The toxicology report is admissible, she said. The footage is clear. Combined with the medical documentation, we have enough for a warrant tonight. She looked at me. Do you want to be home when we make the arrest, or would you prefer not to be? I'll be somewhere else, I said. Somewhere documented. Frank and I drove to a diner on Southeast Hawthorne and sat in a booth near the window. He ordered pie. I drank coffee. I didn't taste. My phone sat face up on the table between us. At 12:47 inches the morning, Detective Kowalski sent a single text. Done. Both in custody. You can go home. Frank looked at the message and then at me. He didn't say anything. He flagged down the server and ordered a second slice of pie for me without asking whether I wanted it. And I found, sitting in that diner in the middle of the night, that I was hungry for the first time in weeks. The house felt different when I walked in. Same furniture, same walls, same maple tree, visible through the front window. But the kitchen smelled like nothing, no soup, no tea, no calculated comfort. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Frank had come in with me. He went to the cabinet above the stove, retrieved the amber bottle with a paper towel without touching the glass, and sealed it into an evidence bag he'd brought. He'd been planning for this, I realized. He'd probably been planning it since my phone call 4 days ago, because that's the kind of man he was: thorough, quiet, thinking 6 steps ahead. The kind of man who knocked on a grieving neighbor's door with a casserole and then stayed for the conversation. I sat at my kitchen table for the first time in weeks and ate a sandwich Frank made from things in my own refrigerator, and it was the best thing I'd tasted in months. The arraignment was on a Monday. I sat in the gallery with Frank beside me, and I watched my daughter and her husband stand before the judge in clothes that looked wrong on them. Not orange jumpsuits yet. That would come later, but the stiff unfamiliarity of people who'd never expected to be standing where they were standing. My daughter's eyes found mine in the gallery. I don't know what expression she expected to see. Whatever it was, I didn't give it to her. Her attorney argued for bail. The judge looked at the medical reports, the camera footage, the toxicologist's testimony, and the paper trail Detective Kowalski's team had assembled over the weekend, including my son-in-law's communications with 2 different people about the inheritance timeline, communications he'd stupidly conducted through his personal email. Bail was denied. My son-in-law broke first. It took his court-appointed attorney approximately 4 days to negotiate his cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He provided a complete account. The plan had been his. Initially, he'd researched the compound online, purchased it through a third-party overseas vendor, explained the dosing method to my daughter. My daughter had agreed. My daughter had administered it. The prosecutor, a methodical man in his 50s named Deputy D.A. Garrett, walked me through the plea offer a week later. My daughter would plead to second-degree attempted murder plus criminal mistreatment of a vulnerable adult. 8 to 12 years. Parole possible after 7 with clean behavior. Her husband, for cooperation and a lesser role, would receive 4 years. Both would plead guilty. No trial. "We can take this to trial if you want the full measure," Garrett told me. "The footage alone is devastating. But the plea gets certainty. It gets them both. And it gets you out of a courtroom." I thought about a trial, thought about my daughter's face across a courtroom for weeks or months, thought about the particular exhaustion of testimony, of being the central wound of a public proceeding. I thought about Margaret, who had loved our daughter with a completeness I'd always admired. And I thought about what Margaret would have wanted. Margaret would have wanted truth told and consequences honored. She would not have wanted ceremony. "Take the deal," I said. The sentencing was on a Thursday in December. Portland's November rain had turned to the heavy gray that settles over the city like a second sky in winter. I wore the same dark jacket I'd worn to Margaret's funeral because it was the most serious thing I owned, and what I was doing was serious. My daughter stood before the judge in a gray jumpsuit, and she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. The judge read the terms. She said she understood. Her attorney read a prepared statement expressing remorse. I had been offered the chance to give a victim impact statement, and I had declined, because everything I had to say was in the documentation, and everything that mattered beyond documentation was between my daughter and whatever remained of her conscience. The judge sentenced her to 10 years. Her husband received 3.5 with eligibility for parole at 2 years, in exchange for full cooperation. The gavel came down. Bailiffs appeared. My daughter was led through the side door, and I watched her go, and I felt the precise thing I had expected to feel. Nothing simple. Not relief, not satisfaction, not grief, exactly. Something more like the moment you close a case file you've worked on for years. The facts don't change. The outcome doesn't undo what was done, but the motion forward is now possible. Outside the courthouse, Frank was waiting. He'd sat in the gallery with me and stepped out ahead. He handed me a coffee from the cart on the corner without saying anything, and we stood side by side watching pigeons navigate the courthouse steps. And I thought that there are friendships that exist before loss, and friendships that are formed entirely inside it. And the second kind are something you can't manufacture. "How are you?" he asked. "Getting there," I said. We walked to his truck. The drive home took us through neighborhoods I'd known for decades, the bookstore on Division I'd been going to since the 90s, the park where Margaret and I used to walk Sunday mornings, The bakery that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape of the city the way trees do. Portland looked like Portland. That was something. The toxicologist cleared me formally in January. 3 months of clean diet, Frank was still bringing food every morning. A habit we'd both stopped explaining and simply continued, and the compound had metabolized out of my system. The shaking in my hands was gone. The fatigue was lifting like weather. Dr. Marsh told me at my January appointment that my numbers looked better than they had in 5 years. And she said it with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering good news she'd been worried she might never get to deliver. "You're going to be fine, Walter," she said. I told her I was beginning to believe that. Frank had started staying for dinner most nights. It began naturally, the way real things begin. I'd be cooking something after he dropped off food, and I'd say, "Are you staying?" And he'd say, "Sure." And then at some point, it stopped being a question and became a habit. And habits, when they're the right kind, become the structure of a life. His daughter in Seattle called him every Sunday, and I'd hear him on the porch laughing at things she said, and it made the house sound the way it was supposed to sound. We watched the Blazers lose games we'd agreed to watch together. We drove up to Multnomah Falls on a Saturday in February, when the ice was still on the edges of the creek. He helped me finally fix the third stair. I helped him sort through 32 years of paperwork from his career that had accumulated in banker's boxes in his garage, and we spent a weekend building a fire in his backyard fireplace and burning what didn't need to be kept. And there was something clarifying about that, about deciding what the past was worth keeping and what it was worth releasing into smoke. I received a letter from my daughter in February. Prison postmark, her handwriting careful and small, the way it was when she was trying to seem composed. I stood at my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon with the envelope in my hands and the bare maple tree overhead, the one she'd been planted the year my daughter was born, and I considered it for a long time. I brought it inside. I set it on the kitchen table. Frank was coming for dinner at 6. I made coffee and sat with the unopened envelope in front of me, and I thought about what reading it would require of me and whether I was ready to require that of myself. I wasn't. Not yet. I put the letter in the drawer beside the notepad where I kept grocery lists, and I closed the drawer, and I made pasta for dinner. Frank arrived at 6 with a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir that he'd been saving for something, and when I asked him what the occasion was, he said, "No occasion. That's the point." We ate at the kitchen table Margaret had picked out at an estate sale in 2004, and I told him what Dr. Marsh had said, and he told me about his daughter's promotion in Seattle. And the wine was good. The house was warm. Outside, the February rain came down the way it always does in Portland, steady and indifferent, and somehow, after enough years, a kind of comfort. I had changed my will a third time in January. The house and everything in it now went to the Oregon Children's Foundation in full, with a specific bequest for Frank's favorite hiking trail restoration project, because he'd once mentioned it in passing, and I'd remembered it because that's the kind of detail that matters. There was no one to inherit anymore in the old sense of the word. But what I had built over 67 years would continue past me in ways that Margaret would have recognized as right. In March, I drove past the house my daughter and her husband had been renting when they showed up on my doorstep with 4 suitcases and a plan. It was occupied by someone else. Now I could see children's toys in the driveway and lights on in the upstairs windows. Life continuing. Life filling spaces that had been emptied. I didn't stop. I drove home. There was a message on my phone from Detective Kowalski. She called occasionally with updates, parole timelines, legal formalities, the routine maintenance of a case that had been closed but whose edges still required monitoring. I called her back, and she told me the cooperation agreement with my son-in-law had been fully honored and that his early release proceedings would begin in 6 months. She also told me, professionally and matter-of-factly, that my daughter had been placed in a rehabilitation program inside the facility, which was not her recommendation but the court's, and that the program had a reasonable completion rate. I thanked her. I meant it. I sat on my back porch that evening, the same porch where Margaret used to read in the late afternoons, the same chairs we'd bought together at a furniture store in Lake Oswego, the year after we moved in, and I watched the sky do what Portland skies do in early March. Cycle through gray and pale blue and a brief, improbable gold before settling into dark. The maple tree was starting to bud. I'd been watching it long enough to know how to read its pace, to know that what looked like nothing, week after week, was actually preparation. Frank came out with 2 mugs and handed me one and sat down in Margaret's chair, which had stopped being Margaret's chair somewhere around December and had simply become the other chair, the one Frank sat in when he was here, which was often, and we sat without talking for a while, which is the particular gift of a friendship that has been built in hard weather. She wrote me, I said. I know, he said. You told me. Still haven't opened it. He nodded. He didn't offer an opinion. He understood that some things had their own timing, and that the role of a good friend was not to accelerate it. I would read the letter eventually. Maybe in the spring, when the maple had fully come back. Maybe later. The letter wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I. What I knew, sitting on that porch in the early March evening with coffee going cold in my hands and 38 years of case files behind me and whatever was left ahead, was this. I had been targeted by the one person I should have been safest with. I had been deceived by love, or what had worn love's face long enough that I'd stopped examining it. And I had survived it not because I was extraordinary, but because I had built habits over a lifetime that couldn't be turned off, even when the evidence pointed somewhere I didn't want to look. Truth-telling, number following, case building. The skills I'd used to protect strangers' pensions turned out to be the skills that saved my life. My daughter had calculated everything except for the man I actually was. The evening finished itself the way evenings do. Frank went home around 9 with his characteristic lack of ceremony, a brief nod, a see you tomorrow, no drama in the leaving. I locked the new locks and walked through my house and checked the security camera feed out of habit and saw nothing but empty, safe rooms. My own rooms, my own house. Nobody else's plan for it but mine. I climbed the stairs, paused at the window on the landing that looks out at the maple tree, and stood there for a moment in the dark. The buds were barely visible in the streetlight, but they were there. I went to bed. In the morning, I was going to call the Oregon Children's Foundation and ask about volunteer work. I had time now, and Margaret had always said the best thing you can do with a skill is use it somewhere it's needed. 38 years of forensic accounting was exactly the kind of skill a nonprofit could use, and it was exactly the kind of purpose that might make a house feel like a home again. Not through filling it with the right people, but through being the kind of person the house deserved. Sleep came easily. No dreams, or none I remembered. Outside, the maple tree stood in the dark, the way it had stood for decades, through one weather and another, patient and indifferent to anything except the season it was actually in. Spring was coming. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to Phantom Vengeance. Share your thoughts in the comments, we read every single one. And if you've ever faced a betrayal you didn't see coming, tell us how you found your way through. To hear the next story, click the box on the screen now. Thank you for watching.